All right, I see we have lots of participants already when we immediately open. That's wonderful. Welcome to Feminist Reset. We're going to talk tonight about centering collective care in a post-COVID future. My name is Martha Painter, and I am the chair of Wellness Within, one of the host organizations this evening. And to begin, I would like to do a land acknowledgement for where I am, where Wellness Within is based, and where CCPA and one of the Fernwood offices and so many of our partner organizations are based. So we are in Mi'kma'ki, the unsurrendered, unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. And when we do a land acknowledgement, we do so with a commitment to work towards truth and reconciliation and to follow the calls to action from the TRC report of 2015. Our organization in particular works to address over-incarceration. And so I want to tell you a little bit about Wellness Within. Our organization is a registered nonprofit in Nova Scotia that works entirely through volunteerism. And we have a vision of a world without prisons, a world where women and gender minorities are living with reproductive justice in their lives. And it's very relevant to the work that we saw come out of Nora Loretto's book, Take Back the Fight, that we do this work without any core funding. And we need that position to truly advocate for a radically different world than the one we're in now. All right, so I want to tell you about tonight. We have closed captioning available, and detailed instructions on how to enable this are in the chat. ASL English interpretation is being provided this evening by Ayoka Junaid and Kimberly Johnson. Thank you so much to both of you for doing that for us tonight. And thank you all for being here, and to our speakers and my colleagues who co-organized with me, including Christine Saunier. So I turn it over to you, Christine.
Thanks, Martha. Happy International Women's Day, everyone, and welcome. I am Christine Saunier. I'm the Nova Scotia Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And I'm very pleased to be a host organization this evening. CCPA Nova Scotia is an independent policy research institute, and our mandate is really about social and economic justice and environmental sustainability. When I think about International Women's Day and its origins and intention was really around advancing women's equality. That's about decent work, about a living wage, decent benefits, dignity, respect, safe working conditions, all things that are central to CCPA's mandate. In fact, today, CCPA Ottawa released a new report that's called Women Work in COVID. It very much relates to a lot of what we will be speaking with you tonight. I think Lauren Matheson with CCPA is going to be helping us with tech support, and she will be putting things in the chat. We'll try not to crowd the chat, recognizing that people who need closed captioning need us to not do that. So I do want to just say that one of the things, of course, that we have learned over the pandemic, and that this new report shows us, is that women have been pandemic shock absorbers. And some women have done that more than others. So please sign up for our newsletter. Keep up to date on our work. Again, we'll put a little link there. I'm super pleased to be here this evening. Wish we could be in person. I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator this evening. Fazila Jiwa is a writer and an editor. She has a special interest in social justice and radical politics. I'm going to put a little link to her website in the chat for you. Fazila is an acquisitions and development editor with Fernwood Publishing. She's my neighbor. She's the mother of a wonderful little girl. I'm going to hand it over to Fazila. Thank you so much, Fazila, for hosting, and to Fernwood Publishing for being one of our key hosts and organizers this evening.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Martha. Thank you to Ayoka and Kimberly for ASL interpretation, and Lauren for organizing the tech support. So I just wanted to start by mentioning that we're celebrating IWD today, of course, and even though it's been taken up a lot by corporations and other, mainstream organizations, the roots of it are in socialist struggle for the recognition of the rights and the work of women, and specifically the struggle against capitalist exploitation. So I'm thinking today about abolitionist organizers, Black feminists, the Indian women farmers who are protesting right now against injustice, Indigenous water protectors, and so many more that should be celebrated today. So, and I also want to say, the working hours are done. Speaking of, corporations and all that, but I'm chuckling about the irony that I have to warn you that this beautiful little girl that Christine mentioned might scream in the background because it's bedtime. So I might be on mute and turn off my screen. It's just the way things are. So I'm really happy to be celebrating IWD with these incredible intersectional feminists. As Martha noted, the theme for tonight is Feminist Reset, centering collective care in a post-COVID future. So we're going to be talking a lot about collective care and what that means. I just want to note also that this event is being recorded. We have several sponsors that I have to thank, and then we'll get into the speakers. So Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Nova Scotia, of which Christine is a part, is hosting this. Wellness Within, which Martha is a part of. ADSM for Women and Children, Alexa McDonough Institute, Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, Canadian Union of Public Employees, Nova Scotia, Local Council of Women Halifax, and Fernwood Publishing, which is where I work. And I wanted to mention that we have a Women's Day sale. There's 20% off all books, including some of those that our brilliant speakers have published. So I'm going to read out all of the bios, very impressive bios of our speakers first, and then we're going to get into the conversation. There is a chat, as you are aware of, and if you have any questions during the speakers conversation, please put them in the chat, and I will pose them as they go with the flow of the conversation. So we have Elle Jones, Nora Loretto, and Julianne Acker-Verney. Elle Jones is a spoken word poet, educator, journalist, and community activist living in African Nova Scotia. She was the 5th Poet Laureate of Halifax. In 2016, Elle was a recipient of the Burnley Rocky Jones Human Rights Award. She is a co-founder of the Black Power Hour, which is an excellent live radio show with people who experience incarceration on CKDU. She supports women in Nova Institution in writing and sharing their voices. Elle also served as the 15th Nancy's Chair of Women's Studies at Mount St. Vincent University for the 2017 to 19 term. And her book of spoken word poetry, Live from the African Resistance, was published by Fernwood in 2014. Nora Loretto is a writer and activist from Quebec City. Her new book is Take Back the Fight, Organizing Feminism for the Digital Age. She writes regularly for the National Observer, the Washington Post, and many other publications. She is the editor of the Canadian Association of Labor Media. And with Sandy Hudson, she hosts a popular podcast called Sandy and Nora Talk Politics. She's also the author of From Demonized to Organized, Building the New Union Movement. Julianne Acker-Verney embraces her life as a woman with disabilities, sharing the adventure with her partner, Tim, in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Julianne has extensive experience as a self-advocate and supporting other persons with disabilities seeking access and inclusion. She's an experienced community-based researcher who has recently completed her MA. Her MA thesis focused on supporting the full participation of diverse women with disabilities in research. Julianne is active in social justice initiatives and organizations, including as a past member of the Independent Living Nova Scotia Association Board of Directors and the Alexa McDonough Institute for Women, Gender, and Social Justice Steering Committee. She currently sits on the Halifax Lancers Board of Directors and the Halifax Lancers Therapeutic Riding Committee. So tonight's theme is, again, Feminist Reset, Centering Collective Care in a Post-COVID Future. And my first question for you, anyone who wants to start, is how do you define collective care? I feel like it's a very broad and well needed definition. So who wants to start?
I guess I'll jump in since no one's taking it. The first place I want to start in collective care is in my own family, which is actually a matriarchy. Until this generation, we only had like one boy per generation. So my entire family is women. And of course, Black women that lived through colonization, enslavement, and came out the other end. Well, we're still trying. So what my family built up as a means of survival was this way that women cared for each other. My mom's oldest sister was the first Black woman to integrate the convent school in Trinidad. They had to let her in because she scored so high on the British exams that they have, like the exhibition scholarships, that there was no way to deny her. And that was what integrated the convent school. And it was off her back that my entire family rose up. Because she's quite a bit older than my mother. When my mother needed to go to school, they didn't have science for girls. My mother left Trinidad to live with her in London. But, you know, my mother has told me stories about, you know, having coffee and an apple all day while she studied by herself for her A-levels. And my aunts that were in New York working as domestics, sending her, you know, $20 that they didn't have and saying to her, you know, go buy yourself a winter coat, go buy yourself some boots. And my mother never spent that money. She never bought herself anything. And then when her next oldest sister was like, I wish I could go back to school to be a teacher, but I don't have the money, my mom just sent all that back and said, I've saved it, you know, here you go. And this was the kind of ethic that was in my family. My 90, millionaire aunt to the day she died sent my mother $20 American every Christmas because it was this sign of this was how women are going to support each other. I was always brought up within this history of women making women's lives happen, women caring for other women, and women sacrificing themselves for the well-being of the collective. And that is, of course, embedded in the ways that Black women came out of enslavement. Often in our stories of slave rebellions, we highlight obviously male rebellion activity. And of course, women were able to escape less. Obviously, women had to care for families, but women did things like tend provision grounds and give food to people as they, escaped, like Queen Nanny in Jamaica, who famously, of course, created freedom communities that is now on the Jamaican money. So we have a long history of revolutionary care in Black communities that is so often read as simple nurturing and not as political activity. I also want to cite Harriet Tubman here. With the only money Harriet Tubman ever received from the US Army when she was serving as both a nurse and a spy in the Civil War. She took that money and created a cooperative laundry. so that all the women, the Black women working in the camp, could create a laundry where they could take in washing and then generate wealth for themselves. She also, at a time when the Black men of her time were advocating resettling Africa and colonization in Africa, she was advocating communities of other mothering. I think we can read Harriet Tubman as queer, probably. She rescued her niece and brought her into her family. So she was creating other mothering families, new economic systems, the world of abolition, in other words, that we are still imagining today, that Harriet was imagining in the 1860s. Far ahead of her time in terms of the kind of political rhetoric, and of course was known as the general. So she wasn't simply nurturing and caring, this was political work. And today, I think, when we talk about abolition, for example, we so often leave out that care work that is being taken by working class women, the people packing the boxes, the people taking the phone calls, the people driving to the prison, and all the ways that people use those activities to subvert the jails, to stick stuff into the boxes that aren't supposed to be here, to find ways to three-way the call, to find ways to speak back to the jail. That work has always rested, particularly in the labor of working class women, that is built up through networks of care and community and sharing. And that, to me, is abolition work, that is future work, and that is political work. And it's the work that is so often exited from our frame in favor of, speaking in public, being the celebrity organizer. I mean, things that I am. So I'm not like, saying there's no role for that. But that is when I think about collective care, it is that work, the work of women in buildings organizing themselves so the social worker doesn't come. The women in Winnipeg lining up so social workers can't take babies off birth alerts from the breasts of Indigenous women. The women who have at times, said, you're not taking this person away to jail, or taking in people's children so that the mother can go to school. These are all the things that actually not only sustain us now, but build the future that we long for. So that's where I would start.
Amazing. Julianne, do you want to take the next bit? How do you define collective care?
Hi. I would say in terms of collective care, I think of I will say it's care in itself as a term. I don't know, it's kind of a loaded term for me. So collective care, I think of in terms of, my responsibility and my desire to care for others as I can, regardless of whether they're in my immediate family. It doesn't matter about geography, that kind of thing. It's about thinking about others. It's about trying to, keep the door open so that others can pass me on the way through and reach the heights that they want to. In my 20s and 30s, I was just trying to get through the door. In my 40s, I was trying to keep a place for myself through the door. And now in my 50s and going into, my 60s and so on, I'm really wanting to just hold the place that I'm at so that others maybe can see me through the door and move beyond and go where we need to go as a society and so on, that is inclusive of everyone, including women with disabilities. But care as a term and as a concept sometimes can be problematic. So there is the whole thing about deciding who decides what care means, who decides who deserves care, who is worthy of care, who decides what that care looks like, who decides whether or not they can say no to that care. And even, do we share an understanding of what care means? So I don't have as many answers as I have questions about the definition of collective care. I know what I feel in my bones I want to do to provide care, to be part of supporting collective care, But I think the concept of care has been used for good and bad, with benefits and consequences.
Thank you for troubling the definition. I always like that. It's very important questions. And Nora, perhaps you have some other definition of collective care?
Yeah. Thank you for those interventions that took care in different directions, but in the same different paths on the same direction is perhaps what I'm looking to say. The thing that I've been so preoccupied with during the pandemic has been related to this question of residential care. And I think that's where Julianne is talking about the problems of where we see the state, what happens when care becomes put into the capitalist model, when it's defunded, when it's run off of the oppression of other people, and then thinking about the care that Elle is talking about, and how important that care is for survival and for community building. And certainly during this pandemic, I think that the biggest political story has been the complete failure of government to care for us, to care for people who need care, to care for communities who need care, and to ensure safety of everybody in different ways. And so what has been the most inspiring things that have happened during this pandemic? It has been that community-based care that doesn't wait for the government, that looks at the government and says that is not the path towards us fixing anything. And that does it themselves. You know, I was speaking on a panel last week with Sarah Gemma from the Disability Justice Network of Ontario, and they're feeding 6,000 people free meals in Hamilton, Ontario, of anyone who's saying that they need help for food, or who are disabled, or who are immunocompromised. And I think that is like, that right there is an example of the kind of community care that allows people to get through what is obviously a historical and difficult moment. But when we move into that residential care discussion, what does residential care look like in this country? And it's absolutely a disaster. People have used the term eugenics. People have used eldercide. People have used certainly there are elements of genocide. And I think that those terms are absolutely appropriate. You know, we are sitting at more than 16,000 people in this country have died who lived in care of some kind during this pandemic, of 22,000 people who have died. The percentage is almost 75%. And this is by my own count, which is an undercount. So you can imagine it's probably higher than 75%. And this is an outlier in the OECD country. Canada is doing by far the worst of protecting people who live in residential facilities, whether those facilities are long-term care, or they're retirement residences, or they're shelters, or they're prisons, or they're adult assisted living. These facilities have become the symbol of how lacking in care our society has become. And so it's this double problem and solution that Julianne was talking about, where you have the complete and utter failure, and I would say intentional, in a lot of cases, destruction of life, of people's freedom, of people's health, while at the same time, these incredible stories of community care coming from people who understand very well that in a moment of the crisis, who is going to be given the most? It will be Loblaws, it will be Rogers, it will be the systems that have absolutely already caused so harm within residential living situations. And I think that when we're imagining what comes after this moment, how do we exit this moment? That location of what do we do with institutionalized care in this country is at the core of so many of these questions. And I'm sure we're going to explore that further together tonight.
Yeah, actually, my next question is kind of picking up on that, that dualism that all of you have spoken about, where care is also a political activity, which Elle talked about. And it seems like a lot, Nora and Julianne, you're also getting at that as well. So based on that, care as also community-based care, but also fighting back, resisting structures that do not care. How do we take that into, post-COVID? Because that seems to be possibly happening soon. Tell me what the future will look like if we take that seriously. How about, do you want to go in the same order? Al can begin.
What the future will look like if we take care seriously? Well, this is the abolitionist question, right? So people often envision abolitionism as a taking away and a breaking down, defunding, right? Oh, you guys want to take things away. You guys just want to destroy everything. But in fact, it's actually about building a series of new relations, not only through money, which is the easiest part. And that's why like defunding has become, I think, more easily glommed onto, by the media, because that's at least still capitalist. Like we can understand, moving money from one column to the other. Okay, so we take some money from the police and we put into housing. Got it. You know what I mean? Now they're not doing that. Of course, everybody's refunded the police and they have more budgets than ever, but at least that seems to make some kind of sense within the world that we live in, that, this is about resourcing. It's about budget lines. But abolition is not about simply resourcing and budget lines. Abolition is about the kind of relationships and the ethical relationships we hold in this world. Beginning with the notion of no justice on stolen land, right? Which you often see on posters at rallies, which to take seriously obviously means that, how on earth can we talk about building futures while we live with the genocide daily of Indigenous people, with the theft of resources, with the removal and disappearance of Indigenous people daily from land and space. And so obviously we cannot envision justice without obviously envisioning Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous ways of being, and what that would mean to actually return to that nation-to-nation relationship that we actually hold through the treaties. We cannot envision an abolitionist world that continues to extract resources. And particularly when we talk about prisons, we often make the connection that prisons are so often in communities that have been stripped of resources, that have, like Spring Hill was a mining town. Truro obviously used to be a transportation hub. Renoose is in outside of Miramichi. Like these are places that have depressed working class populations that have lost traditional ways of living. And then the prison comes in and it's seen as a form of economic stimulus. So not only do we obviously have to think about the economics of that, but obviously the environmental reverberations of that and what it means to continue to live in a world where we try to extract infinitely resources that only exist on a finite planet, as people always say. So that means changing our consumption. That means changing, of course, our attitudes towards capitalism, towards property, towards the very ways in which we conduct our being. Obviously, it means like how we deal with conflict, the ways we envision accountability. I often say, for example, that, how do we imagine getting rid of the prison when we can't even challenge the rapists in our friends' circles? How on earth do we think we're going to deal with violence on a social scale? So it means learning how to hold ourselves accountable. It means recognizing harm and not asking for it to be dismissed or buried, but actually leaning into it and thinking about what it truly means to address harm in communities and what our community responsibility for harm is, instead of putting it off onto victims for something to cope alone with and get over with, and something that becomes vaguely embarrassing after a certain amount of time, right? Like, oh, okay, are you still being a victim now, right? So we actually have to really think about that. And of course, the gendered implications of who's asked to forgive and who's asked to move on and who gets held accountable. And we know women are always disproportionately held accountable and guilty in our society. It means obviously rethinking sexuality, family, so everything on every level. And if I went on, we'd be here all evening. So the project isn't just centered in policing or prisons. It's about understanding that we live in a fundamentally violent culture, a fundamentally sick culture, a culture, as others have said here tonight, where care becomes carceral, where the meaning of care becomes foster care or care home, and that we literally take the word care and change it into violence, that we literally take the word safety and change it into violence, such as the Minister of Public Safety, who is responsible for guns, drugs, gangs, and the border, and not for like getting us all blankets and food, which is actual safety. Like the idea that we can't offer affordable housing. These are all things that are actually practical. And I often push back on the idea when we say, we envision or we imagine, we love to imagine abolitionist futures, we imagine. And I'm like, but it's not actually an imagination. It actually is real. Like, we actually know how to decriminalize drugs. We actually know how to give people housing. We actually know that we can let people out of jail, as we did with 41% of our provincial jail population, with no crime spike at a fraction of the cost. We know we can do all these things, but we continue to rely on punishment, on vindictiveness, on harm, on pain, on violence in our society, which is built on the genocide of Indigenous people, which is built on the extracted labor of Black people and people working around the globe, whose labor we constantly extract for our clothes, for our consumption lifestyle. And we can re-envision that as something different. And it's actually not that difficult. The answers are very clear: universal basic income, affordable housing, rent caps, free daycare. Like, these are things that feminists have envisioned literally for generations. And we act like it's new every time we come back to it. Like, ooh, like what if, and it's like the evidence is ample on raising the minimum wage, on, all of these things that are so practical and so proved in study after study after study. But it's because we live in a society built on dominance, built on uncare, built on disposal and removal. And we actually are more committed to those things than we are to a real vision of safety.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to say, if you're nodding along, if you have something to say, this is a conversation. So I don't want to continuously go in a lineup, although we will if nobody speaks. So if someone wants to speak to what Elle just said, please go ahead.
Women don't like to take the stage.
I can jump in. And sorry, I was hearing that, but I was also trying to explain to this is one of my kids who Fazila is, and how Fazila has helped to fix my writing in the way that I helped to fix their writing. This is the fundamental question, is that abolition approach. I'm going to focus specifically on residential care, because that's like really where my head is right now. We've created a system that's based on the prison system as a way to warehouse people who are no longer useful to capitalism. Like, that is literally how our entire approach to elder care has grown in this country. And so we have a para healthcare system that is mostly private, that is mostly for profit, which is just like, if you think about it, it's like they're profiting off of cutting back on meals, cutting back on laundry, cutting back on activities. They're profiting off of paying people less. They're profiting off of hiring people through temp agencies, hiring people who have precarious status or no status as a way to give them the bare minimum with very few job protections. And this has happened over decades. We arrive at this situation with this pandemic. I was writing about this today, and I was just so interested in wondering, what was the moment where long-term care entered the discussion on how COVID is going to shape Canada, right? And there was nothing before March 4th in the mainstream media in this country. There wasn't a political announcement. There was nothing before March 4th. Where were we on March 4th? There had already been deaths in the United States that were known and deaths that were not known. There was already cases popping up in Washington State with mass deaths that were pretty much obviously going to happen within facilities there. And all of the public discussion was focused on hospitals. How do we make sure hospitals are okay, people have ventilators and all this kind of thing. We completely have marginalized people through this idea of caring for them. And it's so unbelievable that the same moment that we're seeing this mass death within residential care facilities as this discussion on assisted medical assistance in dying, where the biggest advancement in healthcare in a generation is medical assistance in dying, is allowing people to take their lives for whatever reason as they get to the end of their life, rather than looking at ways that we can actually deinstitutionalize care. How do we build home care? In this country, 80% of long-term care is spent in residential care, and only 20% is spent on home care. And that grows out of this neoliberal state construction that we've had happening for 4 decades now, where long-term care was able to balloon through the lens of this for-profit, inhumane, and terrible model. And so when we're thinking about how to fix it, like, as Elle said, there's tons of, we know how to fix this. Like there's, you know, you can look at any country about how they treat their elderly populations, for example, or other countries that do have quality of assisted living facilities for disabled adults. We can look at all of these things and say, oh, why don't we do it like this country? Why didn't we have as many deaths as that country? But that's not the issue. The issue is that our government's addicted to profits, that these boards are addicted to profits, and that these profits like are actually inside of a lot of things that you and I and a lot of us have interactions with, right? One of the largest facilities, companies that own long-term care facilities and retirement residences in Canada is a company called Revera, which is set up as a sorry, now I'm just mixing them up because they're all so bad. Revera is set up as a real estate investment trust, right? Like, it's not set up as a place to deliver care. It's not set up like a hospital or a place where you've got doctors and nurses and personal care workers. It's set up to profit off of the property. And most retirement residences are set up like that too. And they're far enough outside of the healthcare system that that's how they're set up. And so, you know, this is a question of capitalism. This is a question of how do we stop this system from profiting off of people's misery or people's care? And, you know, one of the things that I'm very surprised by, and I'll end with this, is it is going to take a movement response. It's going to take people organizing. It's going to take some sort of pressure that is so strong on government that they actually have to relent. And we are not anywhere, you know, a year into this, we're not anywhere near that. There hasn't been that coalescence of movements yet. And I have to say, I'm very concerned. That's, I think, the thing that concerns me, maybe not the most, but one of the things I'm very preoccupied by is what will it take for us to organize into national, provincial, regional structures that will manage to actually force change within the system.
Hi. So I think I'm unmuted. Can someone just confirm I'm unmuted? Can anyone hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
You're
okay.
unmuted.
Thank you. So I'm sorry to stop the flow, but I am going to just explain that this is so I'm blind. I use screen reading technology on everything, and everything like my computer, my PC, my iPad, everything. And so it's a very difficult and cumbersome platform. I long for the days when we can sit in a room and be with each other and have the energy as well as, for me, a greater ease of engaging. So apologies if my comments seem stilted and a little bit maybe out of the rhythm. But what's happening is I'm not able to hear everything that's being said because I'm hearing a lot of other things, and I can't turn the screen reader off, because if I do, then I have no idea where any of the buttons are that I need to tap. So apologies to you all. Having said that, I'm going to try to turn it off again. Yeah, I agree with everything that's being said. I think if I could add anything to that, it is that there are several things. One is that living in a marginalized space it has become, for many people, more and more difficult, not just because we've become more marginalized, more out of the public eye, more dependent on other people, more made vulnerable by the rhetoric of, you know, who's vulnerable and who isn't, and who's worthy and who isn't of attention and, you know, and even attention. I mean, that is by public health discourse and so on. That's even problematic. But on top of all of that is the complete and utter fear that people have had within, I'll speak to within the disability community, about getting, having to be in a position of having your quality of life as a person with a disability who is generally already considered to have a lesser quality of life than someone who doesn't have a disability. You know, to have your quality of life in a moment of crisis, where there are, you know, we're in this scarcity mentality, and we could indeed be in a very bad place of where we don't have enough ventilators. Remember those days when that has been an ongoing concern. Well, someone who is already considered to have a lesser quality of life than an otherwise able-bodied person has been, in many cases, terrified that they would not be granted the same level of care, or even understood to have a quality of life that was worth protecting. And even though there have been assurances by governments, and I'm thinking of the Ontario government in particular, and Nora, you may have written about this, you can probably speak to this. Even though there have been assurances that that wouldn't happen, there is, I would say, a palpable concern about that within the disability community generally. At least I have felt that when I talk with people. Because, I mean, we have the legacy of harm of forced sterilization. I mean, along with others, obviously not, you know, Indigenous women and poor women and Black women and so on. I mean, but there has been, you know, forced residential experiences of people, abuse within those systems. I mean, this is not, I'm not talking about something that's only relevant to persons with disabilities, but I will say that that is something that I have been really keenly aware of as I've you know, kind of looked through the media reports and talked to people and thought about people in my own life who I know, who are dear friends and family members and even just acquaintances. And, you know, you think, you just worry that our contributions, because we're often considered burdens of care, and the care relationship is often thought to be a one-way street, where there is a provider on one end of the relationship and a recipient on the other end of the relationship, rather than a reciprocal relationship of care. You know, you worry about that. You know, it's one of those situations. Someone said to me one time, "What do you want to do? Blow up the lab?" And it's, yes, that's what I want to do. I want to blow up the lab. I want to change things. I want to change the very systems on which this marginalization and I don't know, pervasive devaluing of people is based and perpetuated. I do want to blow up the lab. Now I'm going to try to find the mute button.
Thank you for those comments. I'm really struck by, again, this dualism where care is, as Elle said, also kind of spoken of as care, but really it is like a disguise for violence. And also the fact that care, as Julianne and Nora have pointed out, is a community process. And so there's a lot of talk, I think, about structural change and organizing, which has, as you all have noted, been done. It's not just in the future, it is happening and has happened for generations. So how do we support those of us who are not organizing? How do we support those who are organizing, I guess, against the care that is violence, and also those who are providing care, those who are needing care and receiving care in the, you know, in the reciprocal way that Julianne's talking about.
I guess I'm always going first, so we'll just stay with that. First of all, I'm a believer in everybody something, you know, from everybody something. So I don't know if the question is necessarily how do we support the people who are doing X. The question is what is within our capacities to do. Now that looks different for every person. Like if you have childcare, if you have limited mobility, if you have, not everybody's going to be doing work in the same way. But I think one of the points of collectivity is everybody has something to contribute. Not everybody's going to be the person at the front of the rally, or, you know, the person, I don't know, making the policy like recommendation, but somebody needs to bring the coffee to the elders. Somebody can do the driving. Somebody can, you know, like, I don't know, we always need people to amplify things, to send the email. The person that can give out hugs, the person that's the voice on the phone. Like, this is all equal work. And part of capitalism when it comes to organizing is devaluing certain types of organizing and pulling up a type of celebrity activism, and then imagining everybody as simply the bodies that are called to the protest and then go away, right? So our imagining of political activity right now is we hold a protest. There's some people at the front who are the spokespeople. Everybody else is required only to get enough bodies in the space. And when the day's over, you go home, and that was your role. But that's not actually organizing. So the question is, what does it mean for people to organize where they are within their needs, to their capabilities and capacities? And what does it mean for all of us to mutually support each other in that work? You know, this is something like in my community where people have been telling on themselves a bit lately, and we have, like, you know, these cis het men that are always held up as our needed leaders, because God forbid should queer and trans Black women be leading these movements, right? We can't have that. So we have to impose these men. And one of the things they openly say is, like, we can't have thousands of people in the streets. Like, we need one person. And like, their belief is some people should do everything. And of course, the revolutionary belief is everybody can do something. How do we talk about an equal society when we don't value everyone's labor equally? When we privilege intellectual labor over hands-on labor? Where we privilege class labor in particular ways, where we devalue in particular the work of working class women as, you know, either just nurturing or literally invisible. When we, you know, read certain types of labor as just not readable at all. So we don't even imagine that, you know, somebody living with a disability could contribute any kind of organizing energy, because it's just not even imagined. It's not even with our purview of the idea of like what that looks like, especially if we're only holding protests and marches and things that people actually can't participate in. So yeah, I think that we need to change our idea of organizing to be collective as well. And if we're not doing organizing, it's difficult. It takes a lot of work. It's always easier. Any group you're in, there's always like 3 people that do all the work. There can be 100 people or 500 people or 4 people. There's only like 3 people doing the work, you know. But why is that? You know, and this goes to like the self-care question, right? The way that we constantly kind of hold up a few and then go, how do you care for yourself? And it's like, well, shouldn't we be mutually caring? Like, shouldn't that be something that we're all involved in? And, you know, I mean, which was something that, you know, our revolutionary forebears understood. They understood that, you know, that cooking in the demilitarized zone was important, that nurturing was important, having a home space to go to is important. And so, yeah, I think that we also need to change this very celebritized, very individualized. Ironically, as we fight neoliberalism, we've adopted like the most neoliberal notion of what organizing and activism looks like. It's celebritized. It's often very centered in the young, not because young people aren't amazing and can't contribute, but that's a form of disposability politics, right? Oh, you old like crone, like, you know, get out, like, what do you have to contribute, right? It's the idea that like older women have nothing to contribute like to our movements, and in fact they are just repositories of knowledge. All of this is part of neoliberalism, and neoliberalism likes us to believe it's all encompassing so that we despair and don't believe we can do anything. And in fact, there are many cracks in the system, but the way we fight them is by not replicating it. The way we fight it is by finding ways to move against that.
Nora, I know you have lots to say about that.
Yes, I do. No, I mean, everything that Elle says is, I don't need to repeat any of that, other than, you know, you always have to be careful when the 4 people that are doing all the work and one of them's the cop, right? And you're like, oh God. And those stories are always fun to tell, kind of like battle wounds, right? How did you know that person was the cop? One of the things that was so interesting when I was writing Take Back the Fight, so you know, I was finishing a draft in February 2020, right? Like just before the pandemic. And I was trying to write to people who might be one of those individuals to be like, I just don't know what my role could be. I don't know how I can get involved. I don't know where I could start. Like really, you know, folks that are new to activism or just don't have the, you know, the experience to understand that, as Elle says, like there really is a role for literally everybody to play. And so I was really heavying up on my rhetoric around, you know, we have to resist the desire to do everything online. It's really important for us to be together and all this kind of stuff. Like the kind of resistance of neoliberal organizing that, you know, the internet was like, no, you can, Me Too will change everything. It's like, no, Me Too will not change anything unless there's action behind it. And so when I reread that for a final edit in, I don't know, lockdown hell of May, I was like, okay, no one needs to be told now that we can't live online exclusively. And it was just such a funny gift in a way that this pandemic has given, that it really does expose the limits of that individualized activism, that we actually really do need to be in presence of other people, and we need to come together in so many different ways. And that's not just like debating bylaws, which is something that a lot of people get off on, but not a majority of people, right? But that can dominate a lot of like the activist work that some people do, or marches and rallies, or the physical manifestation of our citizen power or whatever. No, it's actually like also just hanging out. It's also helping people out. It's also helping someone move. It's also, you know, going to the hospital with someone if they don't have anyone else that they could go with, or everyone else that they know is working. Like really basic, individual to individual, like collective activities that we just now are like, I know things in Halifax are not Quebec City, but my God, like I haven't been in anyone's house literally in a year. Like I'm coming up on the year anniversary that someone was in my apartment that doesn't live with me. So I think that the pandemic gives us this wonderful opportunity to be able to talk about this need, about what does collectivity give us? What does organizing together give us? What does struggle mean? I take a lot of solace in the word struggle, right? When you struggle alongside someone, you build relationships that you never thought could be possible. You become friends with people who completely like annoyed the hell out of you for the first, you know, year and a half, right? And you're like, oh my, you're actually charming. Wow, I'm so glad that we got to struggle together. And I realized like in the thick of everything that you were the only person that, you know, ran to get hand warmers, right? Which are like, that person's a god, right? You're organizing and it's minus 25 outside. So, yeah, we do have to, I think we people who have experience in organizing have to resist that celebrity individualized pull that really does exist, and exists in so many different ways. And talking to people that have never been involved in anything, being like, yeah, it's kind of like a sports team. You know, there's a goalie, there's a forward, and there's going to be someone that's kind of not great. So you're going to find a place for them, and it's not going to be the attacker. That's okay. There's no problem with that. And we're going to see each other all the time, and we're going to become friends. And you know, it's like, okay, now I understand what organizing is a little bit more. That yeah, I'm going to be the one with the megaphone on the truck and the one getting the crowd going, right? That's creating community. That's creating movements. And it's those solidarity bonds, that's the bonds formed in struggle, that we absolutely need. Because if we're going to resist power, that is dangerous, that is difficult, that is taxing. And if we don't have those mutual connections with one another, if we talk instead about individual self-care, we don't have the trampoline being held by everyone that can catch you if you're falling, right? We don't have those collective ways of caring for one another that we really do need to get through whatever struggle we're going through right now.
Julianne, are you interested in commenting on any of the organizing that Nora and Elle are talking about, or do you want to pick up a little bit on speaking about the reciprocal care and how you can support a kind of reciprocal care that you were describing earlier? You're still on mute.
Yeah,
Julianne is asking if you would unmute her, please.
Yeah, it says we have to ask you. I don't know why. We're trying. We don't seem to be able to. Oh, there you go. You're off mute,
I think
Julianne.
I'm on.
There you are.
I'm sorry.
No problem. We'll, yeah, go ahead.
I would say just to hopefully contribute a bit to what Nora and Elle have said. One of the things that I think, you know, as I have said, I guess I've come up through a variety of decades in my activism, and I've done various types of activism as I have aged, also as my life has changed. So, you know, when I could see and now that I can't, things have changed. When I could hear and now that I don't hear well at all, things have changed. So there's, you know, but one of the things that I think I really feel is important to do now is to allow others to come to the fore. So I always really think now about whether or not I should be the face on the screen or whether my voice should be the voice other people are helping me unmute. Because while I think I have, you know, I've learned some things, I have an awareness of some things, historical things and so on. And I can definitely, I want to be involved, but I think it's really important to make room for other people, new ideas, new emotions, you know, for other people to become involved in the way that they want to, be supported in that, find their own language, find their own dignity, and passion in the way that they confront injustices. I think that's really important. It was important for me. It was important for friends I came up with through disability rights, learning about them, trying to advocate for them, etc. And that work's not over for me. But I think one of the things that I can do is to support others to find their voice, and to support their coming to the fore in terms of argument and change and feeling, not just feeling the anger, but feeling the reward of moving the dial. Because as much as I want to blow up the lab, it's a big old lab and we have seen change, but there's much more to do. And I'm looking forward to supporting others to do that as I try to do some of it myself. Can you mute me?
Yes, I'm going to mute
Thank
you.
Thank you for this amazing conversation so far. And something that I keep thinking about that, you know, it comes to me every single day, and you have all spoken about it too, is I'm not sure that a lot of things have significantly changed because of the pandemic. I feel like a lot of what you've been discussing tonight existed before, and COVID kind of was, you know, the relief that we needed in terms of seeing what wasn't there before. That was there already and was invisibilized, or I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the continuities and how we can, you know, if there are any new lessons that COVID has taught us.
Well, unfortunately, most of the lessons are off the backs of the exact same people who don't get columns to talk about the lessons. So the people who feel the least impact to those of us who can work from home, right? So in that sense, you know, you maintain your job, you just move everything online, which is obviously different from the people that have either lost their work or are working in extremely like precarious conditions. And we know, I mean, it's the same thing we saw it this summer. Oh, like the world is shifting, we have an uprising, and then like we refund the police, you know. Me Too, as Nora pointed out, you know, there was like, this was supposed to be our inroads into harassment, and a couple of people went to jail and then things returned. So I mean, we always have these outbreaks of what we believe is a sea change, but the reality is history doesn't work that way anyway. So I mean, that's the problem, is we always want to reproduce a false idea of the 60s that never existed in the first place, and then we're always trying to reproduce this social movement that we only have a fictional account of, and thinking that that's what progress looks like. So no, I mean, obviously, like we know that corporations got more money than ever. We know that the class gap that already existed simply widened, as it has continued to do for the last 40 years plus of austerity. We know that there have been no changes to things like social assistance. We took people out of jail, we put them right back into jail, so we are a society that is generally impervious to learning the lessons that we need to learn, because they're never learned off the backs of the people who need to learn those lessons. One thing I thought was interesting about the anti-mask stuff is it's the first time the elites are actually placing themselves into the condition that they bequeath to others. But of course they have medical care, so I mean, I thought it was interesting, because normally what we get is the elites will tell you not to wear a mask while they make sure to wear their mask, right? But we actually did see Trump and stuff going around without masks, but of course it doesn't matter to them, because they had the experimental drugs, they had the admittance to the hospital, they had the 24/7 care, so they didn't suffer the same jeopardy as obviously people relying upon public hospitals that literally didn't have ventilators. So we always want to pretend we're learning lessons, but the reality is that they're always learned off the backs of the people that are already deemed to not matter in the first place. And as long as the profits keep flowing, who cares? So the answer then isn't despair, right? And this is what I sort of said about neoliberalism, that one of the sort of problems of neoliberalism is it can seem all encompassing, right? They're in our phones. I know they're watching us. I can't, it's not like you can storm the Bastille these days, right? They would know everything that you're going to do, and you'd be met with security. These ideas that you could take this one act and the Bastille would fall and then there was a whole revolution. We don't live in that age. And that can seem discouraging, right? Because what can we actually do? Isn't it all just knocking up against the wall? And that's what we also have to fight, that sense of it's so powerful, there's nothing we can do. I mean, we are seeing Amazon workers unionizing, right? So we're seeing in America, has been historically the most anti-union place, and union support is higher than it's ever been at any point really in history since ever really, and certainly since the 30s. You're seeing remember when Fox News did that exit poll, and the majority of even their own viewers supported healthcare, and supported even didn't really care about immigration. They're cool, leave the borders. So what is the problem is the elites are out of step with the growing majority of the people. And that has always been the problem. But what it shows us is that, this isn't a closed system. So I'm not a believer in this, we just take great strides in history and then everything falls. We all know that, we get some tokenistic changes. Right now we get, some brown people in positions of power, and we're supposed to settle for that. Our task is to not settle for that, and to keep pushing, and to keep finding new ways and cracks in the wall, and to keep pushing through, because, we know society has changed. We know it can change, and we have to believe it can change, even in small ways. But yeah, if any of us think that, Ian Rankin is going to wake up tomorrow and be I see the light, let me give a universal basic income and let's make all housing free. It's just not going to happen. So change doesn't come in that way though. As Howard Zinn, I think it's Howard Zinn who says it's not who's sitting in office, it's who's holding the sit-in, right? And that's remains true now.
Yeah, I was joking around with Sandy right before recording a couple of weeks ago, and I was wow, this pandemic, I didn't think it would be possible, but it's really moved me from being a socialist to fully an anarchist. I do think that I agree with everything else said, and I think that the political awakening of this moment for average people is what the pandemic is changing. Depending on where you were at the start of this pandemic, you either had a little bit of faith in government and you have no more faith in government, or you had total faith and you have less faith. I have this fellow that calls me every 7 weeks or so, and he was a lifelong conservative, and now he's Nora, how do I pay to take out ads in the Toronto Star condemning the Conservative Party over their treatment of elderly people, right? And it's just there is a consciousness that is shifting. Now, consciousness shift isn't enough to change anything. This is where organizing is just so important, that people are now going, okay, they're whoa, like they really don't care about us. And so, like, you know, those of us doing this organizing, I don't think have been probably surprised by anything during the pandemic. In fact, most of us have been saying this is what's going to happen with the wage subsidy. This is going to be what happens when you don't give CERB to the poorest Canadians. I mean, this is obvious, right? And then the elites are like, oh, wow, what the hell? This is so surprising. Like, what do you mean, you know, the banks got this much money? It's like, oh, the whole thing was organized so that the banks would get this much money. This is all organized theft. And like, this is, I think that this is how we have to talk about this. It has always been this way, and it will be this way, though it doesn't have to be this way. And I think that that element of hope and that element of us being able to change the decisions of politicians, I think that's literally all we have, right? And that pressure needs to be built in different ways. We need to have a diversity of paths that we take to try and change those political decisions. But we also have to be very honest with ourselves, as Elle said, that change does not just happen like this. That like really at this point, the fight that we're in, I think, is just making sure that things don't get way worse than they were before the pandemic. And that alone will be a massive victory. And not just a massive victory, because then you also have people whose political consciousness shifted during the pandemic because whether the scales fell from their eyes, whether they, were completely betrayed by something, whether they've seen their friends radicalized to the far right, which is something else that I think we have to figure out how to deal with within society. People are becoming political. And I think, we all organizers, activists, people who are doing this work, have done this work before. That's where you have to find your friends, find your acquaintances, create those spaces, do what you can to pull in people to these movements and find places for them to get involved, because that is the victory of this pandemic. That, and also, I mean, our mRNA technology is also super great. Like that is really a great thing about this pandemic too, the vaccines. And it's also, I think, important to take stock of that too, that we've just witnessed a moment of humanity where we've accelerated something that could not have happened. It could not have happened. It's never happened before so fast to create a vaccine. RNA technology has never happened before, and it's going to have incredible benefits for other kinds of medical problems that we face. And so with that optimism, we have to radicalize, politicize, and find ways for people to get involved who've never seen themselves as being an activist before.
Hi, Julianne, we have to ask your consent. It's how Zoom is set up. There you go. Why don't you don't have to mute yourself if you don't want to, just leave it. You're good.
Okay, am I good?
Yes.
So, I mean, I think, I kind of feel like dead weight on this panel. I think Elle and Nora have just, said what needs to be said. I think it's true. I would concur, agree with everything they've said. I do think that we have, I'll speak about Nova Scotia maybe, that there has been some sense of collective responsibility, but I don't know that means that we're really caring for each other, we're sort of looking after our own backs and in terms of keeping numbers low and restricting our own our behavior. Those of us who have a difference between restrictions and eased restrictions. There are many people who don't experience that same difference between, when restrictions are, when we're in lockdown and when we're not, because, there are those of us who are always in lockdown. Either there's not money to take a cab and they don't feel safe to take Metro Transit. I don't feel safe taking Metro Transit, to tell you the truth right now. So I haven't. Or folks who just don't, they require assistance to leave their homes, and that assistance is not there. I think, one of the things that I have noticed within the discourse over the past year is that everyone is supposed to have a family. and you're supposed to be, you know, caring for your family and looking after each other. And there are many, many, many people who do not have family, who do not have close friends, who are, who feel really shunned from society. And, you know, I think we need to just shed some light on that, and it's not good enough to go back to where we were. You know, that wasn't that great a place before the pandemic. Everybody wants to go back to normal. I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people talk about going back to normal. I don't think that's where we want to be. And I know you know, my colleagues on the panel are talking about moving to other places as well. It's not about getting back to where we were. It's about moving forward to a place where people can experience better quality of life generally. And, you know, I totally agree that not everyone is going to find their way to the same type of activism, but everyone does have something to contribute, even if that's supporting the activism that happens and the organizing that happens. And, you know, I'm very hopeful that that happens, that continues to happen.
We are going to take audience questions for the last 15 minutes, but there aren't any right now. So, oh, wait, there's one from Nan. I see greater cuts and underfunding in our future with the COVID debt used as the rationale. What do you see as the strategy in this fight? And yeah, I've been hearing a lot about austerity measures, as we've seen, which do nothing. So, would anyone, how about we start with Julianne this time? So the question is, COVID debt being used as the rationale for austerity. So do you see a strategy in fighting this kind of logic?
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I think yelling and screaming. I think yelling and screaming, shame and guilt. I don't know, like whatever it takes, I think we have to do. Austerity, I mean, we know who's going to be affected by austere budgets. It's going to be the people who are already living in austere conditions. So I think, you know, just whatever we can do, whatever noise we can make, I think we have to make.
Mm-hmm.
I can maybe answer next. I think there's a very strategic kind of part to this question. I think we have to assume that that's what's going to happen. That's absolutely what will happen. They will use this moment of economic crisis to defund whatever they can, unfund whatever they can. And I think
for police.
Yeah, except for police, right? No, they will take all the money and give it to the police, and before you know it, your personal care worker is finally making $100,000 because it's a cop, right? No, so I think that that this is where unions and activist groups have to be very strategic in how they talk to the population about funding, right? It's like this whole crisis was because of underfunding. And you look at someone like Jason Kenney and he's like, oh yeah, and we're also going to cut all the healthcare workers right now. And you're like, you're in the middle of a healthcare crisis. Like, how do you have the guts to do something like that? That seems completely outrageous. Well, he doesn't need the guts. It's because the opposition is so unclear in explaining this sometimes to people that we really do need to have very clear communications, very aggressive campaigns, campaigns that actually scare people, and unions especially have to be prepared to go on strike over this stuff. And not just go on strike over, but like actually explain what the funding situations are. So, you know, you want to take an example like private for-profit long-term care, you know, it's not going to just be the personal care workers who may or may not be unionized. Some are not. That going on strike is going to necessarily win more care for long-term care. You have to look at, okay, well, what about transit strike to fight for long-term care? What about teachers? Where are teachers in this fight? Not necessarily fighting in their classrooms, but also fighting for better social conditions. Because this is where I think you know, in Quebec, there still is a common front negotiations that happen where the unions across the sector will, the unions bargain sector wide, but they're cross unions to fight for different things. And I think that we have to see this as a moment for working people to be together in solidarity. And that also means that unionized workers need to take radical action to protect non-unionized workers and those workers who are on the front lines, those grocery workers, the cab drivers, right? My God, cab drivers have died at a rate higher than any other industry in this country. And that's nowhere in the discussion. And so, yes, austerity is absolutely coming. So the real question is not, is this coming or is it not? But what are the radical actions? What kind of power do we have to be able to confront governments and frankly, force them, scare them into not touching any of the public services and in fact, actually funding them better?
I'll jump on the next two questions. So we have, in what ways does the media catalyze collective care, and in what ways does it inhibit collective care? I mean, I suppose, first of all, which media are we talking about? Like, are we talking about mainstream media, the ways people use social media? All of which are both a curse and a blessing, right? Like, we obviously know through mutual funding networks that obviously was spread online. Here in Nova Scotia, the Black Lives Matter Fund raised completely unexpectedly. We started with a COVID fund for Black people that our goal was $10,000, to which we had 400 applications, which would have required $40,000. And then all of a sudden, when this summer popped off, we ended up with $300,000, which we have been able to, we had to come up with a whole model to distribute that fairly across the province into community to allow communities to have a say in that funding. So it wasn't about the money as well. It was also about us coming up with a way to like show that you don't have to skim off the top when you get money, you know, that the community can have a say in money, and trying to do things differently among that group, which is Lynn Jones, Twyla Gross, Dr. Rachel Zellers, and myself. I didn't do as much work, really, honestly. The rest of them did way more work than I did. But that was to remodel something important. So, you know, like it's always like communication is there, right? And we have to both use it, but also understand the constraints it places. Because of course, the media always, as Noam Chomsky tells us, they always like to set a window of seeming left, but setting the barrier on how far left you're supposed to go, which goes into the second question from Voice of Women around like, why don't we have any conversation about the military? And exactly, like that's considered out of bounds, right? We have entire elections where nobody talks. Well, first of all, we barely talk about foreign policy, period. And then we certainly don't talk about Canada's imperialism, Canada's mining companies, partly because we imagine that as an American conversation to the extent that we imagine it. And then, yeah, it's just not being on the radar at all. It's just not something we talk about. And yeah, we had an entire election cycle and nobody will take a stand on this. You know, you can't get the NDP to like take, I mean, when we had the forum earlier, and people will remember who were at this forum where the NDP was like blatantly like supporting military funding and like military action, like military incursions, because it's seen as unpopular, probably because it's seen as a job situation, right? And this is like prisons, where it's like, well, you know, since we strip education resources from people, your options are the military or go be a jail guard. So like, I guess we need military and we need prisons, right? But yeah, it's been like the destruction of the peace movement, partly which is to do with, again, I think our disposal of earlier activism and our lack of knowledge about that kind of activism, the shifting priorities of the left. And I think one thing we have to figure out on the left is how to both maintain things like anti-racist work and maintain class discussion. We tend to, of course, imagine those as separate. Like we tend to imagine the working class as white. Like everyone still imagines like, you know, the steel worker, like the male steel worker. It's like, no, it's like the woman greeting at Walmart. You know what I mean? Like, but, we have allowed identity to be taken up in particular. You're seeing this with the Democratic Party, just in ridiculous extent, right? Like oh, Kristen Sinema like cut the minimum wage, but she's a woman and she's bi, you know? Oh, you can't be racist to Kamala Harris, right? So this completely vulgar, completely shallow, and completely disgusting using of the identities of the elite in order to disenfranchise people. And we have to have a discussion about how to both address oppression, address racism, which are important things to address, and also maintain class and build class solidarity. And I think a lot of these questions have been abandoned because, again, under a kind of neoliberal division policy of the left, we are pushed into like caring, like as if, you know, we don't care about Mr. Potato Head. And then it's like suddenly, you know, the right wing pretends we care about Mr. Potato Head. And then you have like media contacting you to like talk about Mr. Potato Head. Like, and I'm like, I don't care. Like potatoes don't have genders. Like you know, what is this? But then it's created as an issue, and we'll spend hours on the air talking about Mr. Potato Head instead of talking about like people dying in prison. And so, yeah, we have a lot to do in terms of resisting those kind of narratives, particularly, again, for younger people who don't necessarily have good access to movement history, to movement elders, and this is why we also need to very actively educate young people into movement history, like, do people know how active the peace movement was and is in Halifax and those kind of fights, and what can we learn from that today? And we have to, resist. We always have to push for within our movements for people to understand various axes of oppression, but we also have to resist the way that is being flexed against us right now. And the last thing I'll say, I know I'm talking long, but a model for that is within like the prison movement, where you have, people that come in who are like hardcore abolitionists from a political point of view. You obviously have like Black and Indigenous people coming in from a particularly like oppression race point of view. And then you often have like poor white families whose like family died in prison. And maybe they didn't have an analysis around prison. Like lots of them will say, like, they told me you'll get the help in there. And like, I believed that my sister was going to get mental health care. I didn't know any better. And then we have to collectively figure out how to work towards this goal of fighting the prison. And not everyone, like at first you have people that come in and like, why are we talking about Indigenous people? Like my sister's white and she died in prison. And we like work on that together, and that's what coalition work is. And we find commonalities and we work with each other and we figure out how to come into conversation. And we're told we can't do that work, and of course we can do that work. So I think it's also a failure of left and the leftist discourse right now, which is really abandoning, or has been abandoning, those kind of topics for like simpler topics like potatoes and who tweeted what.
We have probably a few minutes left to take this last question, which again is about media, and from Scott. It's a long question, so I'm going to just interpret it as, do you believe that media and communication can have a major role in struggle, or is it an illusion to believe that artistic activism could bring about the end of a neoliberal hegemony, as Chantal Mouffe says? Julianne, did you want to say anything about that, or Nora?
I'm sorry, I'm processing the question.
Julianne, I can start if you want to go right.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the question, of course, has the frame at the top of must have a vexed relationship to my own medium, being extremely online. And when honest to God, when people are like, "Oh, Nora, I know you from Twitter," like it actually like does suck. I'm like, God, what do you mean you know me from? No, you should know me from something else. So it is very weird. And I think it's really important to mention that my activism is not Twitter. I mean, some of my activism is Twitter, but the work that I do in my community that I rarely post about, partly because it's done in French. And so there's just like I don't feel like translating it to Twitter. That it's way more important, I think, in some ways. But the question, is artistic activism on its own going to bring the end of neoliberal hegemony? The answer is no, nothing on its own is going to bring the end of neoliberal hegemony. We need so many things to coalesce for us to be successful in bringing down anything that we want to bring down, that to imagine it to pass through only one thing, I think is I mean, it's foolish. What I will say though, is that the left is not good with art. Like we really do need to have a conversation about like making good art, how to make good art. I mean, there's this like classic line from Orwell in The Road to Wigan Pier about how like the socialists have never written a good song, and so obviously they'll never win. Right? Which is, it's something that's like, I mean, funny and like true. I'm not gonna say it's true, but like, but I think of someone like Christy Belcourt, whose art is so political and so beautiful, and she's one of Canada's best artists right now, probably best artists in the history of Canadian art, and art in Canada, I should say. And her art brings expression to an entire decolonization, liberation spirit that she's connected to directly, but also not directly connected to. That other people see this art and see this reclamation of indigeneity, indigenous beauty, of expression that is not text-based, that is visual, that is artistic. That's a part of it, and we need to have art, we need to have literature, like leftist literature is something that like we really need to do more of. We need to have, like, Elle is like the premier poem writer and performer on the left. We need to have lots of them, lots of poems, and even though sometimes I don't get them, like in general, this is the thing that we need, and you can kind of judge the strength of the left through our art. Right, through spectacle, through design, through fashion, through audacious things that you just can't believe, like smoke bombs and makeup and things that I don't wear makeup, but you know, people do, and it's beautiful when it's done really, really well. So yes, it's nothing on its own will bring the revolution, but will the revolution happen if there's no art or if there's no artistic practice? No, of course, absolutely not. No, we absolutely need that.
And honestly, what went through my mind when I heard art and is that so much of it is visually, only accessed visually. I love, you know, the spoken word and song and so on, but you know, even, I mean, I think we need to broaden our sense of art to be accessible to everyone. I agree that it's not going to be, someone asked me one time when I was working in food insecurity and poverty, what was the right way to advocate for change? And I said, there is no one right way. I absolutely agree. It's a multitude. It's everybody pulling together in the ways that they can in their own realms, in their own communities, but working together to make change. I think that's how we're going to see change come.
Thank you for that. I think there's a few more questions, but we're at 8:29 and I'm going to call this to an end. I think that's a really good note to end on because we're talking about collective care, and I just want to thank you all for a very wide-ranging, very broad, and still so focused discussion on how change is happening right now. So thank you so much to Elle Jones, Nora Loretto, Julianne Acker-Verney. Thank you for the ASL interpretation, Yoka Janae and Kimberly Johnson. Thank you for the tech support, Lauren Matheson, and thank you for organizing, Christine Saulnier and Martha Painter. Thank you for everyone who watched. Have a happy the rest of IWD. I'm gonna put my kid to bed. She has been screaming in my face. Apologies if anyone heard that.
Thanks, Fazila, for your moderating.
Thank you, Martha, Christine, Fazila, for the organizing work as well.
Thank you for everything.
Be International Women's Day.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.